Good Wednesday morning, everybody. Welcome into your Freightwaves Now Community Spotlight on this Wednesday. We get to check in with the one and only Alan Adler here to update us on this week's episode of Truck Tech. Alan, thank you for joining us this morning. And we are talking about alternative fuels, where electrification is getting all the hype, but some folks are saying, whoa, 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 not so fast. Internal combustion engines are here to stay. Break it down for us.
Well, I think everybody will tell you in one way or another that they think internal combustion engines are here to stay, at least for a while. A group that feels though they're here for the long run, though, is the Engine Technology Forum, which used to be known as the Diesel Technology Forum. Now, that name change is significant. It's only one word, but it's significant because the Engine Technology Forum takes into account more than just diesel. And so they're looking at all matters of drop-in fuels. These are things that, you basically would pull up to a pump and put into your tank. And that could be natural gas. That could eventually be hydrogen. It could be renewable diesel, renewable natural gas, any number of things that you could run a vehicle on. And so our show later today, is with Alan Schaefer, who's the executive director of the Engine Technology Forum. We've had Alan featured recently in the Truck Tech newsletter talking about a number of things. Today, though, we get into some issues around decarbonization itself. We talk a little bit about some of the things we tried really hard not to get into the weeds on, like the low carbon fuel standard and things like that in California. But we spent a fair amount of time talking about the presidential election and what happens after November 5th when we have a different president. Are we looking at a continuation of the all things electric push that the Biden administration has really embraced, or are we looking at, coming backwards a little bit, maybe not backwards, but back to what we know best, which is, drill, baby, drill. So, these are things that we talk about, and he's got some interesting perspectives. The group has done some of its own work in terms of research into the election and things like that. So his perspective is definitely worth listening to.
I think that's fascinating because, of course, we sit just about a month and a half-ish away from the election and knowing who our next president's going to be. But current Vice President Kamala Harris has, of course, talked about, as we heard in the debate, that she's not afraid or not unaware of the fact that fracking and oil use and diesel use is something that is still very much a part of the American energy strategy and isn't something that we can just quickly transition away from, which I think is, of course, contrary to a lot of people's thoughts on what the Democratic Party stands for, right? People think like, they think big oil's bad, automatically no. And it's almost kind of refreshing to see somebody on that side come out and just openly say like, no, we understand the fact that fossil fuels are a part of American life and they're not a switch that we can flip to get away from it. But we also know that the Bipartisan Infrastructure Act did put forward a lot of federal incentives to promote this decarbonization standard. Where do you think that we maybe sit if we're looking at the possible undoing of some of that if we do see a Trump presidency and then maybe some reversion of some of those federal acts? Is it going to be more of a reliance on state incentives then and back to this kind of state by state policy, taking away some of, I guess, like the federal fervor around it?
Well, I don't think, according to what Alan was discussing with me, I don't think that there's going to be a lot more from a major sort of electrification push that a Harris presidency could do. Right now, obviously, the Biden administration is trying really hard to get all the money out the door that was promised in things like the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and even the Infrastructure Act. Get that money into the states, get it spent, basically, or committed, so that it couldn't be clawed back under a Trump presidency. The idea of using money that, wasn't distributed, it's easier to get your hands on that. So I think the thought that, you might see more in terms of, big plans, probably not, according to Alan Schaefer, but rather, sort of a caretaker kind of position around electrification. I heard the same thing you did, though, Kaylee, which is that Harris seems, at least, from what she says, to be open to understanding that we have a ways to go to get to sort of that electric nirvana. It's not happening by next year. It's not happening probably 10 years from now. But I think that, her commitment and probably the move towards an energy policy that has more to it than fossil fuels is something that she would stay with. And I don't think that you can undo a lot of what's already happened. I mean, businesses have invested billions of dollars in addition to what they've received in incentives, to move towards decarbonization. So that's not going to stop because we're changing presidents. It's something that might not get a lot more news support, especially financial support. But these investments that are happening are happening now. You've got, just to give you one example, in Mississippi, you've got $2 to $3 billion that three of the truck makers, well, Cummins and two other truck makers, are putting into doing lithium ion batteries, in this country, and onshoring work that, quite honestly, a lot of the battery technology comes from China. And you saw what happened with the Commerce Department this week in terms of basically turning the screws tighter on connectivity and things like that. So a lot of the moves that are underway are going to continue regardless of who's in the White House.
I'm glad that you mentioned Cummins because, of course, we talk a lot about their alternative fuel solutions. And it's the fact that this major OEM is sitting here and saying, you know what? Yeah, we are not necessarily all in on electrification either. We are looking at providing these other alternative fuel solutions with some of their drop-in fuel availabilities for their engine technology. And we know that this is something that I think is going to drive the fiscal policy, the federal policy, as well as the state policy, is that big impact by these bigger groups that are planning their business strategies on it, frankly, right? It's that they can't afford to not have some support from a government standards and regulation side because they are investing this much money into it. Any thoughts on what it looks like, the influence, how big of an influence this business could have maybe on developing some policy, whether that's state or federal level?
I think they have a tremendous impact on it, and they all, of course, have lobbying forces in Washington and that sort of thing. But I think it goes a little farther beyond that. I think, what you're seeing, and I love the Cummins example because I think what they've done and the fact that they can adjust literally on the fly, there's two businesses there. There's the legacy 105-year-old engine business, diesel business, and then you've got what's called Accelera by Cummins, used to be known as New Power. And I had a chance last week in Germany to catch up with Amy Davis, who's the president of Accelera, and we'll be featuring her a bit this week in the Truck Tech newsletter, a conversation that we had about some things that are happening in the electrolyzer space. This is sort of the opposite of a fuel cell. It makes hydrogen essentially, with electricity and water. And, we talked about that, but she reminded me that when they met with analysts, when Cummins met with analysts in March, they stepped back a little bit from the aggressive sort of switch over to all new power stuff from engines, because they recognized that, especially on the passenger car side of things, that there had been a bit of a step back from electrification and some commitments that have been pushed out or maybe even canceled in some cases. So, and they do have exposure, obviously, to that side of the business as well. So I think this idea that, I said, you said a few years ago that you would have $400 million in revenue from electrolyzers in 2025. And she said, we're going to be close. So it's going forward. It's still happening. But I think people are looking at this, they're saying, wait a minute, maybe we got a little too enthusiastic and we moved a little too quickly. So when we come back to Alan Schaefer, who again is on today's show, what you're hearing is an acknowledgement that electrification does have great use cases that make a lot of sense. But you're not going to get there tomorrow, and you cannot throw out everything you're doing and what's been done for decades and decades overnight to get there. That's been his hue and cry since the days when it was called the Diesel Technology Forum. But, again, from a PC perspective, I think they made a smart move by changing the name.
We are the tortoise, and no matter how much we try to be, we cannot be the hare. Alan, thank you for joining us this morning for our Communities Update. Of course, you can catch Truck Tech, the show, this afternoon right here on Freightwaves TV, and head on over to freightwaves.com, subscribe to that newsletter. We will talk to you next week.
Thank you, Kaylee. Have a good day.